Well, we're going to have another tax class tonight, now that the president is desperately trying to prevent the IRS from handing over his tax returns to the House of Representatives. But in tonight's class, I'm not going to be the teacher. I'm going to be the student, because our first guest tonight is the highest authority that we have ever had on this program on taxation. George Yin is a former chief of staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation. Now, you don't hear about that very much, but the Joint Committee on Taxation is a congressional committee composed of both House members and Senate members, and the staff of the Joint Committee actually advises the two tax writing committees and their staff, the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee. And the staff of the Joint Tax Committee are by far the leading experts on taxation in Washington, and the chief of staff of that staff on the Joint Tax Committee is simply regarded in awe by all members of the staff of the tax writing committees. And so I am filled with awe tonight and very excited to have George Yin with us tonight. He was actually hired by Republicans to run the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation. There is usually depending on which party is in power, a Democratic chairman of that committee or a Republican chairman of that committee. Was always a Republican in George Yin's time. But the staff of that committee is always considered nonpartisan. It isn't even bipartisan. It's just they're nonpartisan. They are completely trusted by both sides. And George Yin has actually written the definitive article on the tax writing committee's legal authority to obtain the president's tax returns. And so you are going to hear from the highest authority in the land on this issue tonight, and I'm going to be taking notes. And later in this hour, we're going to hear from the newest Democratic presidential candidate. In our Contenders series tonight, we will be joined by Democratic Congressman Tim Ryan of Ohio. Any Democrat who can win in Ohio is someone the Democratic Party has to pay attention to. And in the lazy labels of the political news media, Tim Ryan is often referred to as a moderate, but I don't know what moderate means anymore, because Tim Ryan is in favor of Medicare for all, which was just a short time ago the most extreme liberal position that you could take in Congress. So you may be surprised by some of Tim Ryan's positions. And remember, there are two slots that have to be filled at the Democratic National Convention: president and vice presidents. We need two candidates. And it's never too early to start looking for a vice presidential candidate who can maybe help the ticket win in a very important state like, say, Ohio. So you're going to want to hear from Mr. Ryan of Ohio tonight. But first, Donald Trump has a new lawyer, and that lawyer is trying to do something that has never been done before. And the reason it's never been done before is that the law is very clear about the case that President Trump has hired his new lawyer to handle. And it may be the case that Donald Trump fears more than any other thing that has happened to him since he took the oath of office. The president's new lawyer is a private attorney who does not work in the White House. He is not on the government payroll. He's a private lawyer hired by Donald Trump to try to stop House Ways and Means Chairman Richard Neal from legally obtaining Donald Trump's tax returns. And we've been discussing, as we've been discussing at this hour for the last two nights, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee has the unique power written into law that allows him to obtain anyone's tax returns. And obtaining public officials' tax returns, including the president, is one of the things that this law was actually designed to do. The law allows the chairman of the tax writing committees in the House and in the Senate to obtain any tax returns they want to see. And no one has ever successfully blocked them from doing that, ever. The president's new lawyer, William Consovoy, wrote a 3-page letter today trying to block Chairman Neal's demand for the Trump tax returns. It could have been a much shorter letter if anyone had ever successfully blocked one of the tax writing committees from obtaining a tax return, because if that had ever happened, the president's lawyer could just cite that case, claim it applies here, and be done with it. Instead, the president's lawyer wrote a letter filled with irrelevant references, political argument, and faulty legal scholarship. In other words, the president has hired yet another lawyer who literally doesn't know what he's talking about. But the president is desperate this time, because there is nothing the president has worked harder to hide than his tax returns. Nothing. The president is happily living with the public knowledge and his wife's knowledge of his affair with Stormy Daniels shortly after his third wife gave birth to his fifth child. I mean, the president was hoping we didn't find out about that, but He sure doesn't seem to care that we did. His tax returns are something else. Tim O'Brien is a frequent guest on this program who has been studying Donald Trump's financial affairs for years, and as a result of a lawsuit, was once allowed to see 1 year of Donald Trump's tax returns when he was a New York Times reporter. Today, Tim O'Brien said this. This is something he is going to fight tooth and nail. It opens a vein. He's the most financially conflicted president of the modern era. The tax returns are both emblematic of that and a potential roadmap of what his conflicts might look like. Because, like most people, most of the news media is usually intimidated by lawyers' letters, you should brace yourself for days of news coverage in which the president's lawyer's letter will be taken much more seriously than it should be. It takes its place among the long list of lawyers' letters sent on behalf of Donald J. Trump that have absolutely no legal basis, like the letter another private attorney sent on behalf of President Trump to block the publication of Michael Wolff's book, Fire and Fury. Charles Harder has had a very successful law practice in Beverly Hills, but his place in the Legal Hall of Fame became secure on January 4th, 2018, when he wrote this absurdist letter to Michael Wolff and his publisher, saying on page 3, Mr. Trump hereby demands that you immediately cease and desist from any further publication, release, or dissemination of the book. And of course, the book went on to be a giant bestseller. That was one lawyer's letter that everyone in the news media instantly knew was a joke because it affects their business. They know that the First Amendment made that letter a joke and helped Michael Wolff's book sales skyrocket. It was an 11-page letter by one of the most expensive lawyers in America, and it meant absolutely nothing, and everybody realized that. And there was no follow-up to that letter, none. The 3-page letter that the president paid for today must have been much cheaper, and even though it has no legal basis, this one is not a joke because it is addressed to a Trump appointee, Brent McIntosh, the general counsel of the Department of Treasury. And the letter asks the general counsel of the Treasury to tell the Treasury secretary to not allow the IRS commissioner to deliver the Trump tax returns to Chairman Neal. The IRS is technically part of the Treasury Department, and so it is technically under the jurisdiction of the Treasury Secretary, although the IRS is usually allowed to operate as a completely independent entity. The letter says the IRS should refrain from divulging the requested information until it receives a formal legal opinion from the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, which brings us to another Trump appointee, Attorney General William Barr. And so this becomes another test of what Attorney General William Barr is willing to do for Donald Trump. But it becomes a test for Donald Trump's commissioner of the IRS, who has absolutely no legal basis whatsoever for not turning over those tax returns by Wednesday of next week, as Chairman Neal has demanded. And so all the Donald Trump appointees involved, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, Brent McIntosh, the general counsel of the Treasury, Attorney General William Barr, and IRS Commissioner Charles Rettig, might all be staring at Donald Trump's lawyer's letter tonight, right now, trying to see if there is any legal hook they can possibly hold on to as an excuse for not complying with very clear law. Or they might not. They might all be honorable men who happen to be appointed by Donald Trump, who take their oaths of office very seriously and recognize that the president's lawyer's letter is a legal joke to be dismissed as soon as they read it. Maybe. The lawyer's letter says requests for tax returns and return information must have a legitimate legislative purpose. Chairman Neal's letter demanding the tax returns says, consistent with its authority, the committee is considering legislative proposals and conducting oversight related to our federal tax laws, including but not limited to the extent to which the IRS audits and enforces the federal tax laws against a president. It is necessary for the committee to determine the scope of any such examination and whether it includes a review of underlying business activities required to be reported on the individual income tax return. And that is why the chairman is asking for Donald Trump's tax returns instead of Barack Obama's tax returns, because Donald Trump is the only president who has significant underlying business activities. The chairman wants to know whether the automatic IRS audit of presidential tax returns includes Donald Trump's business tax returns. The president's lawyer's letter claims that Chairman Neal is only asking for Donald Trump's tax returns because he is a political opponent. The letter makes no attempt to prove that, and the letter does that classically bad lawyer thing of saying that the chairman has no legitimate committee purpose for requesting the president's tax returns, and then immediately says, even if the Ways and Means Committee has a legitimate purpose for requesting the president's tax returns, that's not the real reason Richie Neal is doing this. The letter simply says that the president's lawyer does not believe the reasons Richie Neal gave for demanding the president's tax returns. The president's lawyer's letter also includes this glaring mistake. It says the president has even greater authority than Congress to obtain individuals' tax returns. That is not true. The president does not have authority to obtain individuals' tax returns that is more powerful than the Congress's. It is actually much more limited than committee chairman's authority to obtain individual tax returns. Richie Neal is in his 30th year of service in the House of Representatives, where everyone calls him Richie, just like they do back home in his congressional district in Western Massachusetts. He's not Chairman Neal back there. He's Richie Neal. And he was Richie Neal to me when I was working on the staff of the Senate Finance Committee working on tax policy, and he was a member of the Ways and Means Committee working on tax policy. Most of you have never heard his voice because his approach to congressional life has always been about carefully doing the work and the homework, including carefully doing the work for his constituents in Western Massachusetts so that he is always reelected, but never seeking the limelight in Washington. Richie Neal has had an open invitation to be on this program every night since the Democrats won the House of Representatives. And full disclosure, I think of him as a friend of mine. And he won't do this show because he doesn't want or need the attention. Richie Neal is the opposite of Donald Trump in every good way that you can be the opposite of Donald Trump. And tonight, Donald Trump has no idea what he's up against in Richie Neal. But I, for one, have no doubt who is going to win. Richie Neal is going to get Donald Trump's tax returns. Leading off our discussion now is an honor to be joined by George Yin. He's the former chief of staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation. He is now a professor of law and taxation at the University of Virginia Law School. And also joining us, Democratic Congressman Jimmy Gomez of California. He is now a member of the House Ways and Means Committee. He's also a member of the Oversight Committee, but he's a member of the House Ways and Means, where this demand for Donald Trump's tax returns originated. George Yin, let me start with you. You've read the president's attorney's letter about this. You've also written the definitive article about this law. Give us your review of the president's lawyer's letter, and do you see any merit in it?
Thanks, Lawrence. Pleasure to be with you. That was an over-the-top introduction.
Well, let me just stop you. You know, and Jimmy Gomez knows exactly how us former and current tax committee staff regard the chief of staff of the Joint Tax Committee.
Well,
we always bow.
Thanks. Yep. Very nice. But I completely agree with you. The letter really didn't say anything useful. I thought Chairman Neal's letter request lays out a couple of reasons that would qualify as legitimate legislative purposes. And one of the ones that is laid out, I think, is particularly strong, which is to lend oversight over the IRS's audit of the president's returns. The president has indicated repeatedly that his returns are under audit, but the fact is there have been problems with that in the past. The first audit by the IRS of President Nixon's returns, actually the IRS gave President Nixon a complete clean bill of tax health as a result of that audit, and even sent President Nixon a letter complimenting him on the care with which he had prepared those returns. But on later audits of the same returns, one by the nonpartisan staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation and one by the IRS again, we discovered that, in fact, President Nixon owed almost $500,000 of additional tax and interest. So there's an inherent conflict of interest when the IRS is asked to audit essentially its boss. And it's absolutely the responsibility of Congress and the Ways and Means Committee to exercise its oversight responsibility to double check that that audit is being done appropriately, or whether there's any funny business going on. So I think that the chairman is very smart in laying out that rationale, as well as others, for this request.
Let's listen to Richie Deal. The audience will finally get to hear his voice because they don't hear this very much. He did make some comments yesterday about his approach to getting the Trump tax returns.
We followed IRS guidelines, which suggest to taxpayers that 6 years is generally the measurement that they use for advising taxpayers on how long to keep their forms. So we didn't want to have the case perhaps dismissed on a technical glitch. So again, I think, as I've said to you now for a long period of time, we've taken a very methodical approach to what will likely be an established court case.
Congressman Gomez, talk about the way your chairman has approached this, because you've seen it from the inside. We only knew about it the moment his letter came out saying that he was doing this, but you saw him, how he approached this, how he built to this moment.
You know, Chairman Neal is one of the most strategic, methodical individuals in Congress, and he knew what was going to be before us as a committee and before him. So he was setting up something to make sure that we abided by the law, by statute, and made sure every committee member understood the statute. And this is why he's done it so slowly. He had a lot of pressure on him to go after the taxes right away, but he didn't do that because he knows that this is too important and the American people are counting on him.
Georgian, I want to talk about the law that governs this. It uses the phrase, the Secretary shall furnish the tax returns, meaning the Secretary of the Treasury. And that's simply because of the organizational chart where the IRS is technically within the Treasury Department. Historically, though, these requests have always been handled directly by the IRS commissioner. Isn't that the precedent we have for it? And isn't that why Chairman Neal addressed his letter directly to the IRS commissioner?
Well, yeah, you're right. The commissioner of the IRS has more direct custodial responsibility over the returns. Obviously, people directly under him are the ones who actually have the material that the chairman has requested. So it makes some sense to direct the request there. But you're right, the statute does indicate that the Secretary of the Treasury shall furnish it. So ultimately, the response, assuming that there is a response, the response of the information requested would presumably come from Secretary Mnuchin.
And so, George, let me stay with you on the implications of the president's lawyer's letter. He's addressing it to the Treasury Department, to the counsel at the Treasury Department. He makes a reference to asking the Treasury Department to wait until the Justice Department basically tells them what to do. What's your reaction to that part of it?
Well, I don't really see any grounds for that at all. Again, the law is very clear, and I thought that Chairman Neal's request was actually very smart also in that it was quite targeted. So there's a limited amount of information that's being requested, and I would think that depending on how difficult it is to assemble it, it could be forwarded fairly quickly. I don't really see the need for Justice Department interpretation. The law is really pretty straightforward.
And Congressman Gomez, the president has always said as a campaigner, and he still says, you can't see my tax returns because they're being audited. We don't know if that was ever true when he was a candidate, but it is true that the president's tax returns are routinely, automatically audited by the IRS. But Barack Obama, as president, did two things. He always filed his income tax returns on time before April 15th, and he always released those tax returns publicly upon filing them, even though every one of those tax returns was being audited.
That's correct. Trump has avoided releasing his taxes since he started running for president. And I think we need to really focus in on that. Why does he not want the American people to see his taxes? And this is something that's been done for 40 years. Republicans and Democrats alike have released their tax returns, and even while under audit. So there's nothing that prevents him from actually showing his taxes and putting the American people at ease that he's not under leverage or being leveraged by an individual or by a foreign government.
Congressman Jimmy Gomez and George Yin, thank you both very much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate you starting us off.
Thank you, Lars.
Thank you. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.